Hey everybody, we are going to be starting our second to last unit today. We have to start talking about the Vietnam War, some more Cold War stuff, all right? After I'm done with this PowerPoint, I want you to start working on your Chapter 50 worksheet, which is on your Google Classroom. I'm also posting the study guide for you as well. This unit is relatively short. It's chapter 50 through 53, so it's much shorter than the last unit. Excuse me. All right, but we need to look at ultimately why did the United States get involved in Vietnam? All right, very similar to why the United States got involved in Korea. All right, but we do need to go through this. So, Vietnam. All right. So first of all, where is Vietnam? Vietnam is in Southeast Asia. All right. It's connected, as you can see, to China here. We have North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which we'll talk about here in a bit. Cambodia and Laos and Thailand will all come into this story eventually. All right, but just to give you an idea, this is where Vietnam is. All right, so we're fighting in Southeast Asia, which most of the fighting took place during the Cold War. All right, so why did the United States fight a war in Vietnam? Basically, trying to hold that line against the spread of communism. So if you remember, under Harry Truman created this idea of containment. All right, so Harry Truman with the Truman Doctrine wanted to make sure that we were containing communism to countries that had already fallen to communism, and the United States was willing to get involved in other countries that were fighting against communism to make sure that it didn't spread. All right, now this was in 1947. Okay, when the Truman Doctrine was officially signed in, but the United States did become involved in not only Korea in the 1950s, but we also got involved in Vietnam in the 1950s as well. All right, Vietnam was the longest and most unpopular war in U.S. history. So the Vietnam War lasted, from when it started with the United States was in the 1950s, and when it ended, it was in the 1970s. So over 20 years. All right, now during the war, 58,000 Americans lost their lives. The oldest person that was killed, American that was killed, was 62 years old, and the youngest was 16. 61% of the men that were Americans that were killed in Vietnam were 21 years old or younger. We had 304,000 men wounded, 75,000 were severely disabled, and the United States spent over $200 billion dollars. And this is back in 1950s to 1970s money on the war, all right? So when it started, it was seen as a necessity, but by the time it ended, it was very, very unpopular in the United States. Now, where it starts is in 1954, all right? So originally, Vietnam in the 1880s was actually colonized by the French. All right, it was called originally the French Indochina. Eventually, Vietnamese leaders that were wanting to break away from these colonial shackles wound up going to this guy named Ho Chi Minh. All right, now Ho Chi Minh was a communist leader that was fighting for the independence of Vietnam, trying to break away from France. All right, so this is where the conflict in Vietnam actually started. So in July of 1954, after 100 years of colonial rule, France was eventually forced to leave Vietnam. Now, the United States helped the French fight in Vietnam to try to beat Ho Chi Minh because Ho Chi Minh was a communist. But the way that we helped was essentially we gave money to France to try to help. Now, nationalist forces under the direction of General Vaughan Gep defeated the Allied French troops at a remote mountain outpost of Dien Bien Phu. which eventually ended the colonization of Vietnam. Now, this didn't immediately mean that the communists wound up taking over Vietnam. That's not how it worked. During the peace talks between the French and the Vietnamese, it happened in Geneva. All right, and in the Geneva Peace Accords, they agreed that in 1954, when this ended, when the Vietnam, I guess we could call it independence against the French ended, the Geneva Peace Accords agreed that from 1954 to 1956, Vietnam, very similar to Korea, all right, was going to be partitioned or broken up into two different countries at the 17th parallel. All right, the North, again, very similar to Korea, was going to be controlled by the communists because that northern part actually butted up against China. All right, under the leadership of this gentleman or this guy right here, his name was Ho Chi Minh. All right, and then the South Vietnam, was going to be a democracy. All right, and then 2 years later, it was going to be there was going to be free elections. All right. So in the North, we have a communist regime that is being led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, and then the southern part, or democracy, was being controlled by an American-backed guy. His name is Diem. That's the guy that you need to know. Now, Diem wasn't going to be around very long in this story because Diem was an awful person to the people that lived in South Vietnam. All right. Now, obviously, there was some opposition to the Geneva Accords simply because the United States kind of saw the writing on the wall and didn't want Vietnam to completely fall to communism, because communism was very popular in Vietnam at this point because the communists were the ones that were fighting against the French and ultimately pushed the French out. So Vietnam was leaning heavily towards communism in 1954. So the United States prevented elections that were promised under the the Geneva Conference, because we knew that the communists were going to win. All right. Right down here, you could see a picture. This is Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. He thought the Geneva Accords granted way too much power to the Communist Party. So him and President Eisenhower, who you can see sitting right next to him, supported the creation of a counter-revolution alternative underneath the South Parallel. So essentially, keeping these two countries separate. All right, so the North, you're going to have communism, and in the South, you're going to have a democracy. So even though the United States wasn't truly a part of the Geneva Accords, we kind of pushed ourselves in there. Now, this ultimately was accomplished through the formation of SEATO, which is a term that you need to know. So the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Very similar to NATO, they have SEATO. All right, so if one country that's a democracy is going to be attacked, then all countries are going to be attacked. All right, so very similar to NATO, Southeast Asia has SEATO now. All right, now using SEATO for political cover, the Eisenhower administration helped create that new nation of South Vietnam. And in 1955, with massive amounts of American military, political, and economic aid, the government of South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, was born under this guy right here, Ngo Dinh Diem. Just make sure that you know his last name here, Diem. He's going to be, we're going to talk about him for the rest of today. All right. He was staunchly anti-communist, which was right up America's alley. And he won a quote-unquote dubious election that made him president of South Vietnam. All right. Like I said, this guy was not a good dude. All right. But the reason why the United States got involved in South Vietnam, even after the Korean conflict, was this idea of the domino theory. Domino theory is really important to know please write this down. This will definitely be on your test. So the idea and the justification for the involvement of the United States in Vietnam was the domino theory. All right, essentially saying that if South Vietnam falls to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, and Pakistan would also likely fall to communism. So we didn't want that to happen, so we called it the domino theory. So if South Vietnam fell, then all of these other countries would wind up falling. So let's take a look at that map really quick. I know that this isn't a great map. Here, we'll move up to the first one that I showed you. All right, so you can see, all right, we have South Vietnam here. All of these countries, I mean, they're all connected here. So if South Vietnam falls, the possibility of communism going into Cambodia and Laos and Thailand, and you can't see, but if you follow the map, you have Burma and all those other countries I mentioned would ultimately then fall to communism. So we were very worried about that. We didn't want that to happen. All right, so the domino theory. If one country falls all to communism, all of these other countries are going to wind up falling. Now, South Vietnam under Diem, Diem created this newly created government and was ultimately straight up under attack by the communists in the north. And in 1957, with American military aid, Diem began a counterattack. So he was able to use help from the CIA through this thing called Operation Phoenix, basically looking for communists in South Vietnam, and wound up rounding up and arresting thousands of people. He also passed a lot of repressive series of acts known as Law 1059, which made it legal to hold suspected communists in jail without bringing any formal charges, all right, which is very, very un-American. All right, you can't be held in prison or in jail without actually being charged with anything. So essentially, Diem was arresting his own people for being suspected communists, but not charging them with communism. He was just, or being a communist. He was just throwing them in jail and not letting them out. Now, because of this and other things that Diem did, there was massive outcry about Diem. People did not like Diem. Now, Diem was a Roman Catholic, and he was a part of the minority group for religion, at least, in Vietnam. All right, the majority of Vietnamese people in South Vietnam were actually Buddhists, and he made it illegal to be a Buddhist. So Buddhist monks and nuns were joined by students and business people and intellectuals and peasants who opposed Diem's corrupt rule. Now, the more these forces attacked Diem's troops and secret police, the more Diem wound up complaining and saying that these were communists that were attacking South Vietnam, not actual South Vietnamese people that weren't communists, that just didn't like the way that Diem was handling things and treating his own people. All right. So he was saying that all of this aggression that he was getting was coming from the North Vietnamese, and they were attacking the peace-loving, democratic country of South Vietnam. So he was essentially gaslighting the North Vietnamese communists, saying that all of these problems were coming from the North, and they needed to do something about it. Now, the communists supported the creation of broad-based united front to help mobilize the Southerners in opposition to South Vietnam. All right, so this thing called the National Liberation Front, or the NLF, was created in December of 1960. You should know what this is. All right, so essentially what the NLF did was it brought communists and non-communists together under one umbrella with the goal of opposing Diem and his rule. All right, they wanted to get rid of Diem, and they wanted to unify Vietnam. All right, very similar to, what the Geneva Accords said, that Vietnam would ultimately become one country. The NLF was fighting for that. They wanted to, it was a communist creation. They wanted to get rid of Diem and unify Vietnam as in one country under a communist flag, obviously. All right, and that's where we're going to end. Okay, so short amount of notes today, obviously. I'm giving you the rest of the hour to work on your Chapter 50 worksheet, which is going to be due on Wednesday. If you finish early, you can start working on your study guide if you'd like as well. All right. Yeah, okay. Well, I will see you all tomorrow. Everybody have a great day.